Donc tout d'abord, on a Cristina qui a fait sa thèse à Barcelone sur la communication non verbale et la mémoire chez l'enfant. Et elle est rentrée en postdoctorat au LPNC ici, juste avant le premier confinement, donc avec Olivier Pascalis et Martial Merlier. Et elle va aujourd'hui nous présenter donc, ses travaux sur la perception des traits de dominance chez les enfants de 2 ans. Voilà.
Oui, c'est ça.
Donc quand tu veux.
Merci beaucoup Olivier, bonjour à tous. And I will first like to thank you for the kind invitation, for having me speak to you and see you all here together. It's a real pleasure because I arrived right before the first confinement, so I didn't really get a chance to meet many of you. So I'm really pleased to present some of the preliminary data that I collected here in between confinements and different events. I hope you will bear with my English after the coffee break. If you have any questions or if anything is not clear, please let me know and I can slow down or I can make clarifications whenever needed. So this being said, now that it's Friday morning, it's almost the weekend and we are deconfined, I would like you to imagine that you're going to a party this weekend and these are the first 2 people you're coming across. So here is my question to you. Which one of them would you interact with? Which one would you talk to? So please raise your hand if you would talk to this one on the left here. Okay. And any of you would prefer to talk to the one on the right? Okay, this is a unanimous response for the one on the right. Poor guy on the left. Okay, so this was just an exercise to illustrate a couple of things about how we make character judgments. So as adults, we make these kind of judgments really intuitively and automatically. They appear incredibly quickly in about 50 milliseconds or less, and there's a huge consensus amongst us. And this is not just because we're all, we're here in France all together, but if I were to ask the same question in India or in the United States, most probably the answers would be similar as well. And this is quite important because it's not just that we make character judgments, but these judgments affect our behavior. Even when we're not supposed to make decisions based on appearance, like political elections or courtroom judgments. So there's a whole bunch of literature showing that if somebody looks competent, they are more probable to win the elections, and these have been replicated across many countries and many cohorts. So it's quite important to know where this comes from. Now, if we look at trait judgments, trait evaluations can actually be reduced to a 2-dimensional space, right? So from all of the things that you could judge from a face, usually these can be reduced to dominance that you have here and trustworthiness. So in my talk today, I will be zooming in on the dominance dimension, and I will try to discuss with you the development of this in the first years of life. So what do we actually know about the development of character judgment? If we ask for explicitly children aged 3 to 10 to decide, which of these 2 individuals is stronger, they tend to choose the one on the top. And we can see that from age 5 and 6, you can see here on the graph, their judgments are pretty much like the adults. And although the 3-year-olds also generally choose the same type of face, there is a little bit less consensus than in the judgments for adults. But however, does this mean that they cannot make this kind of judgments before that, or is it that explicit measures cannot be used with earlier populations? So we know that infants in general are incredibly sensitive to faces, and they can make an incredible amount of judgments and show quite consistent visual preferences on dimensions like attractiveness, gender, or race. So it's feasible to ask whether they would be able to judge faces as dominant or submissive. In fact, we have quite a bit of literature coming from the infant literature showing a great sensitivity to dominance cues and to relative power relations in situations of conflict. So just to start with, at 6 months of age only, infants seem to make pretty strong inferences that an individual that comes from a larger group will prevail over an individual that comes from a smaller group. Pretty impressive, right? They also, like at 9 months of age, they have expectations that a larger agent will prevail over a smaller agent. Later on, by 15 months of age, they're actually incredibly sophisticated, and if they see an individual prevail in a conflict over another individual, they expect this kind of dominance relation to be stable across time and to generalize to a different context, right? Like when they fight over space instead of resources. This kind of previous like judgments, inferences based on previous success seems to be a little bit delayed when human agents are involved, most probably because it's a more complex scenario and there are a lot more cues that they can extract from this type of stimuli that may attract them. So this is what we've been trying to do, like to fill the gap between all of these lines of literature. On the one hand, we saw that children and adults can explicitly judge the character of faces. On the other hand, we saw that infants are quite sensitive to dominance relations and to social hierarchies starting very early in life. So are toddlers also sensitive to dominance traits from faces? Is this the case? A second question we're trying to address, or more, rather than a question, more like a hypothesis, is whether this sensitivity to dominance traits is driven by their experience. So would infants' age and their familiarity with different types of faces influence their judgments? And this kind of intuition comes from a lot of work that Olivier Pascalis has carried out, showing that the early experience and the frequency of different face category in the environment actually drive all of the face processing and face development. So capacities that relate to the processing of female faces, for instance, that tend to be the primary caregivers, are quite superior and appear before any capacities for processing male faces. And finally, we're also trying to tap onto whether infants would prefer dominant individuals or submissive individuals, but in this regard, like question 3 is just very intuitive because I don't think we have enough data to really tackle this. But just so you know, there are previous studies on toddlers showing that following a conflict situations, toddlers tend to choose the dominant puppet, but only when they prevailed without using force, without being aggressive. So here is what we did. We tested 2 groups of toddlers, of 18 and 24-month-olds. This is because we previously saw that when using human agents, they can start making this kind of judgments from these ages on. And we used the visual preference task. I'm not really sure how clear this is on the screen, but basically the way this works, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the infant literature, is that we simultaneously show two different images on the screen for a duration of time. In this case, it was 10 seconds, and we measured the differential looking to these 2 stimuli. In our case, we're interested in like the dominance trait. So in order to manipulate this, we used only pairings of faces of the same gender that were also previously rated by adults, and they were matched on other traits like attractiveness and very low level features like luminosity, size, all these types of things. And as previously mentioned, this is ongoing work that I'm currently carrying out in the lab here together with Martial and with Olivier. So, as anticipated a little bit before, we looked at different types of faces that varied in familiarity. So in experiment 1, we used female faces that we considered to be highly familiar because of their frequency in the infant environment. In the second study, we used male faces that are present, they're moderately familiar, but not as frequent as the female faces. And finally, we used artificial faces that have been extensively studied in this type of literature that we consider to be unfamiliar to infants. But they're an interesting set of stimuli because the identity is maintained the same, but only the dominance trait is manipulated between the two. And as a control condition for all of the studies that we ran, we had an inverted condition where the very same pairs of faces were displayed upside down, and this was because we know that changing the orientation of the faces disrupts face processing, and this is a way to control that there's no other feature basically that is very low level that's driving the results. Okay, so here are the results for the female faces from the first experiment. First, I would like to guide you through the way I looked at the data. So here on the y-axis, you will see the different scores. So this is the difference between looking time to each of the two images, so the dominant or the submissive, divided by the total looking time, right? So a positive scores would indicate that they had a looking preference towards the dominant face, while a negative score would indicate a preference for the submissive face. So for the 18-month-olds, we found no difference in difference scores between the upright or the inverted, like the control inverted condition. And for each condition individually, we found no evidence that they looked longer at one type of stimulus over the other. However, for the 24-month-olds, we found a significant difference between the upright condition depicted here and the inverted condition. And when we looked at each of these conditions individually, we also found that only in the upright condition they had a significantly longer looking time towards the dominant face. So to sum up, at 18 months of age, infants do not seem to be sensitive to dominance traits from faces, but this capacity seems to appear at about 24 months of age. For the male faces, at 18 months of age, again, we find no evidence that they are sensitive to dominance traits from this type of faces. And unlike the female faces, for the male faces, they behave exactly as the younger age group. So we do not find in any of the age group evidence that infants are sensitive to dominance traits from male faces. And the same holds for artificial faces, no sensitivity for the younger age group, and the same stays true for the older age group. As you might see, like here, for instance, for the 18-month-olds, like we haven't completed the group, like we're actually missing participants from all of the groups we're presenting, but this one is particularly lacking compared to everything else. Okay, so to summarize what I've been presenting so far, we have no evidence that 18-month-olds in general are sensitive to dominance traits from faces, from the studies that we've run here in the lab. However, yes, and this is contrasting with the previous studies of conflict situations showing that by 18 months of age, they would be able to pick up this kind of cues. But of course, the scenarios and the paradigms are quite different, so there are multiple reasons why we may find differences between the previous study and ours. However, at 24 months of age, we found that infants looked longer at faces that were judged as dominant by adult participants, but only when those faces were highly familiar. So here in our study, they were female faces of their own race. This seems to indicate that sensitivity to dominance traits is the product of extensive experience, and it starts appearing from the end of the second year of life. This is consistent, and it basically goes in the same line with a lot of the literature on face processing, basically showing the importance of experience for face processing, and how the more frequent face categories really tune the way that we look at faces, and how good we are at recognizing them. And finally, a few points for discussion and next steps that we have in mind. Regarding the third question that I mentioned, of whether our study can really be indicative of any dominance preference in such a young group, here we find a preference for the dominant female face, which is consistent with the previous findings, showing explicit responses to dominant characters. However, I think it's important to conduct explicit measures, that this may not be just a response to the character, to the face that looks more threatening or more scary. From the current studies, we're not completely sure at what age infants actually start making these types of character judgments from male faces, so that's something that we may address in our future research. And finally, we're planning to run multiple other paradigms just to confirm that this is really the case, that they can extract this kind of character judgments. And for now, for instance, we're discussing an anticipatory looking task, which would basically train infants to constantly judge which of a pair is the more dominant, and expect a reward, behind the face that appears more dominant in a couple. So these are a few of the things that we have in mind. And with this, I would like to thank you and extend special thanks to my two collaborators, Olivier Pascalis and Martial Mermillot, to the whole team of the Baby Lab who helped with the recruitment and part of the testing, and of course to the babies and to the families that without whom this would not have been possible. And thank you.